Hello students, in this lecture we will be talking about the evolution of our discipline, what we call international relations. We will be basically talking how different traditions of thought and big international events contributed for the growth and evolution of our discipline. We will be proceeding like this. First we will be talking of the ways of understanding the evolution of the discipline. Then we will be focusing on various traditions of thought that contributed for the growth of the discipline. Then we will be talking about 5 great debates that originated in the interwar period, that is after the First World War and before the beginning of the Second World War and continued till today. And then we will be ending our discussion with some concluding remarks. Now let us start our discussion on how to understand the evolution of our discipline. But before that, it would be of interest if we just discuss why to understand the evolution of our discipline. This may be due to two important reasons. The first is it helps to understand why we study our subject, right. So, that will help you to have a better perspective on your discipline. Second, it also helps the current scholarship informed by what has preceded it. So, if you study the origin of the discipline, then you have to know how it originated, why it originated, what are the factors that contributed for its evolution, for its growth. So, these are important issues which we cannot ignore. There are two ways to understand the discipline. For a better understanding of the evolution of our discipline, we will combine both these approaches. The first assumption focuses on the continuous tradition from ancient India, China, Egypt, Rome, Greece and many other civilizations that continued till to the present day. So, there is a continuous tradition of thought, there is a continuous tradition of writings, there is a continuous tradition of arguments that contributed for the present evolution and growth of the discipline. So, they consider ancient traditions as integral parts of the field's past and also relevant. You can't understand the theories of international politics or the concepts in international politics or even the methodologies in international politics without going to the past events, the past ideas, the past thoughts that actually influenced and contributed for its betterment. The second assumption covers on important world events responsible for rise and fall of different theories, methodologies and focus of the field. So, basically those who argue for the second kind of method, they basically focus on important events and particularly past events that had a major role for the present transformation of the discipline, starting maybe from the treaties of Westphalia, maybe the European colonialism and imperialism system, maybe the First World War, maybe the Second World War, the Cold War, the end of the Cold War and so many other events. So, actually these events had a major role in the evolution and the enrichment of the discipline. However, we will consider the first assumption in this lecture. Now, let me focus on different traditions of thought that have contributed for the evolution and growth of the discipline. International politics or international relations may be considered as a very young discipline, particularly as many believe that it originated as a separate discipline after the First World War. But if you look at its history, you will find that it has a history of almost 2 millennium of recorded words, thoughts and actions that you can find from the works of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, Kautilya's Arthashastra, which inspired a different tradition in international relations that we identify as the realist theory. Similarly, Plato's class analysis and dialectical reasoning may not have directly contributed for the growth of international relations as a separate discipline, but it had definitely influenced many Marxist thinkers, particularly the critical theories. Similarly, Machiavelli talked about value-free science of statecraft and foreign policy making, which we consider as an important part of the realist theory. Similarly, Hobbes rejected the concept of anarchy in the state of nature and talked about a social contract, which ultimately resulted in the establishment of a all-powerful Leviathan. Kant's concept of perpetual peace theory contributed and influenced a lot in international relations, which is evident in the democratic peace theory. Similarly, Locke called for natural rights, which he defined as right to life, liberty and property. He also gave the concept of limited government that also influenced a lot of international relations scholars, particularly in the theory of liberalism. Marx's critique of economic power provided international relations with a springboard for its later development. So, basically you will find that these scholars in a way, maybe directly, maybe indirectly, contributed and talked about something which ultimately influenced the evolution and the growth of the discipline of international relations. But there are few problems associated with this various traditions of thought. First, they described and analyzed different actors in a very different perspective, because our understanding of international relations is different, our understanding of international actors are different, but their concept was very different. Secondly, they did not limit themselves to the external relations of states. Basically, philosophers, theorists, they focused on domestic politics, they talked about the citizens' relationship with the state, they talked about the citizens' relationship with the government, they talked about various kind of rights, they talked about different kinds of duties, they talked about political obligation, but they were not focusing exclusively on states' interactions with other states. That is the difference between the traditional political philosophers and what we understand in the present international relations. However, despite these rich contributions, there was no systematic development occurred in international relations disciplinary growth before the First World War. That we are going to discuss in the next slide. Now, let us discuss about the great debates that had a major impact on the transformation of our discipline. International relations is recognized as a separate discipline during the interwar period that started from 1919 to the beginning of the Second World War in 1939. Successive great debates on what to study and how to study, what we call as ontological and epistemological questions, contributed to its major transformation. So, these kind of debates basically covered what are the areas we have to study in international relations, what are the kind of knowledge we have to produce in international relations and how we have to contribute to those areas. So, these were the main issues that is covered under this debate. The first great debate took place between the interwar idealist and the post-war realist. The idealist hoped in reforming the international politics that they caused as the major reason for the First World War. The kind of international politics that was prevailing at that time that basically contributed for the beginning of the First World War. So, that was the reason why the idealist basically focused in reforming the kind of state interaction that was going on at that time. Secondly, they were concerned that the future wars can be avoided through international institutions, because there was no higher authority at the international level. So, if you think of establishing an international institution or international organization that can regulate the selfish behavior of the states, that can regulate the sovereign behavior of the states, and that is how international peace and security can be maintained. The realists dismissed such hopes as wishful thinking and even utopianism, because the idealists did not focus on the realities of power politics among nations, and that is the major emphasis of the realist theory, that if you want to understand the true nature of international politics, you have to focus how the nation states operate in an anarchical system and how power politics governs their state behavior. The failure of the League of Nations and the outbreak of the Second World War caused a severe damage to the idealist paradigm of international relations. So, that also contributed for the popularity of realist theory in international relations. You know how the League of Nations miserably failed and how the imperial countries like Germany, Japan and Italy contributed in a major way for the outbreak of the Second World War. But scholars believe that the kind of settlement or what we call the peace settlement was a major reason for the outbreak of the Second World War. The second debate started between the traditionalist and the behavioralist during the year 1960s and 1970s. The main question before them was what was the most appropriate way of pursuing and acquiring knowledge in international relations. Hedley Bull, an important international relations scholar in the United States, framed this debate as scientific versus classical methods. The traditionalists or who are associated with the classical methods, they have approached international politics from legal, philosophical and historical perspective, or what we call the interdisciplinary perspective. The behavioralists on the other hand sought to emulate the methods of natural sciences because they wanted to make the discipline more scientific and more empirical. Thus, the IR became more scientific and realism lost its dominant position and the field made at par with other social science disciplines like economics or political science. The debate was mainly construed as a methodological debate that took place within a single theoretical orientation, that what we call realism, and was about how to conduct inquiry within that approach. So, it was not on substantial issues, rather it was basically focused on methodological issues, how to make international relations discipline more scientific, more practical and more empirical. Now, let me focus about the third great debate. Now, the third great debate called inter-paradigm debate took place in 1970s and 1980s. It was basically between the realists and liberals on the one hand and the Marxists on the other. Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye's theory of complex interdependence, Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory, John Button's Cobweb theory, Cadso and Felleto's dependency theory directly challenged many tenets of political realism. They basically attacked the core claims of state centrism, the notion that independence rather than interdependence characterize the condition of international relations, and a clear-cut distinction could be made between high politics and low politics. As I said, high politics basically focuses on international relations, particularly the issues of peace and security, and the low politics is associated with economic issues, with trade and commercial issues. Thus, there was a growing focus on the issue of interdependence and interdependency that led to a distinct subfield in international relations, what we call the international political economy approach. The fourth debate started in late 1980s and it was between the positivist and the post-positivist over the relationship between theory and reality. It was reflected in the growing influence of new critical perspectives in international relations such as feminism, postmodernism, critical theory, and sometimes we can associate the debate with constructionism. They start with the basic premise of Robert Cox, who famously declared that theory is always for someone and for some purpose. They basically question the meta-narratives of liberalism and realism, that what they said about the functioning of international politics are final and equally applicable to all the states irrespective of their position in international politics. Let me explain how a theory can be used for vested interest. There was a theory called white man's burden theory, which is considered as a theory that justified imperialism and colonialism. According to this theory, God has made some people as white and some people as blacks, and it was the whites' moral duty to civilize the blacks. But we know how this theory was used as a justification for imperialism and colonialism. It was Dadabhai Naoroji who in his famous book The Draining of Resources highlighted the colonial and exploitative nature of British imperialism in India. He explained how the British imperialism and colonialism ruined India's economy, culture, agriculture and everything, and how the resources were looted and utilized for the industrial revolution in Europe, and how these looted resources were used by the Britishers for their further imperial expansion in different parts of the world. Many scholars and economists believe that India was the largest economy in the ancient period, contributing almost 25% of the world GDP. India became the second largest economy in the medieval period, but it became a third world country in the colonial period. That explains how theories can be used and abused by someone for some vested interest. The critical theorists also question the distinction between the inside and outside dichotomy. They believe that there are some issues in the domestic level that influence the international politics, and there are some international issues that also influence the domestic politics. So, we cannot make a distinction between the domestic politics and international politics for a better understanding of international relations. They also argued that the concept of inside and outside hierarchy are all socially and historically constructed devices for organizing political life. It empowers the sovereign states to pursue their self-interest through power politics, right. So, these are all justified and highlighted by the realist tradition in international relations. But the problem with this approach is that it disempowers and renders invisible social classes like women and marginalized. So, when you talk of power politics, you talk of international politics as a struggle for power, you talk of national interest, you talk of arms race, you talk of diplomacy and many other issues. So, in a way you do not give equal importance to the marginalized, to the voice of the voiceless. So, that is the reason why the critical theorists were highly critical of the mainstream theories such as realism and liberalism. The critical theorists contributed to the field's pluralistic character, generated an expansive body of interesting literature and forced the field to confront new meta-theoretical questions. But it is still debatable to what extent they were successful in their attempt. But we cannot deny that the debates and discussions and the issues raised by the critical theorists played a significant role in expanding the scope and nature of international relations. Now, let us focus on the fifth debate. The fifth debate is about the polarization of the discipline around the core, that is the West, and the periphery, that is the non-West, about the discipline's international character. Thus, there was a debate on both the ontological focus and epistemological focus of the discipline. There is a lot of literature on this issue, and the conclusion is that the academic study of IR is marked by the British and especially the American parochialism, what we call the Eurocentrism in international relations. The debate began since Stanley Hoffman, an American political scientist, declared international relations as an American social science. Amitabh Acharya, an Indo-American international relations scholar, at his 2013 presidential address to the International Studies Association, called for a global international relations using and interpreting narratives, history, concepts, theories and paradigms from non-Western discourses. As I said, there is always a perception that although we call our discipline as international, it is actually not international because it caters to the needs of Europe and America. It originated in those countries, it is based on their history, it is based on their culture, it is based on their civilization, it is based on their language, it is also based on their idioms. In view of these reasons, there is a debate and call to make international relations a truly global. Now, let me end the discussion with certain important concluding points. The traditions of thought approach provides the premises, the tenets and the concept to discuss and analyze international relations systematically. There is no doubt about it, because as we discussed that the international relations theories, the concepts, the methodologies we used in our discipline are in a way influenced by the past writings of the great political philosophers. However, there are many problems and difficulties with this epic tradition, beginning with the classical Greece, India or China. So, it is not that we do not have any problem, we have so many problems and we will discuss them one by one. First, the multitude summary accounts of history of the field commits the error of confusing an analytical with a historical traditions. There is a difference between a tradition and a research tool, and if you confuse the analytical methods with a historical tradition, so that will be a blunder. So, that is the first criticism. Second, it diverts our attention from actual academic practices and individuals who contributed to the current identity of the field. What about the contribution of Aurobindo? What about the contribution of Vivekananda? What about the contribution of M.N. Roy? What about the contribution of Gandhiji or Jawaharlal Nehru for that matter? So, Jawaharlal Nehru contributed a lot for the non-alignment movement, but how many people, how many scholars actually discuss his contribution to international relations? So, when you focus on the past traditions, you in a way compromise the present for the sake of the past. So, that was another criticism. Third, the idealized version of the past often serves to confer legitimacy to a contemporary research program. Many scholars believe that international politics or international relations originated after the First World War, and when you think about its tradition right from the ancient period till today, in a way you compromise and in some way you give importance to the past tradition at the cost of the present. Similarly, there is no evidence that the 5 debates actually occurred in international politics that in a way contributed for its growth and transformation. We can say that particularly for the first debate that we trace during the interwar period and immediately after the Second World War period. Second, the stylized versions do not do justice to the nature of the controversy taking place. There are so many issues which we have ignored in the process of the genealogy of international relations and the history of international relations. So, when you are thinking of a kind of debate, this debate, first debate, second debate, third debate, so that in a way undermines and sometimes it does not explain the kind of real issues, the kind of real controversies that may have contributed actually for the development of the discipline. Third, by focusing only on 5 great debates, we overlook the additional and extremely important disciplinary controversies. So, there are many issues that we can think of, like gender, like the role of marginalized, like the role of many sections of the society that may have contributed or their experience may have contributed for the growth of the discipline, but in a way we have ignored it or we have not covered them, their voices or the voice of the voiceless in the growth of the discipline. So, that is again another criticism. This analytical framework gave international relations greater sense of coherence, but at the cost of actual history of the field warranted. So, you may think of the ancient political traditions, you can think of different traditions of thought, you can think of 5 great debates. So, that may help you to better understand the history of international relations in a systematic way, but to some extent it is not focusing on the issues or the history of the field that was actually needed. So, that is another criticism. Finally, it is also criticized from global southern perspective because it locates the international relations disciplinary growth from the western history, writings and cultures. As we will see in our future discussion, there is a strong criticism that international relations is highly Eurocentric, it is parochial, and it serves the needs of America and Europe. It does nothing for the global south, or it is not based on their culture, their experience, their history, their literature, or their civilization. So, because of these reasons, this kind of understanding of the history of international relations is highly criticized. Thank you for your patience. We will cover the next lecture, particularly highlighting on how international relations can be understood through events driven wisdom. Thank you very much for your patience.